Thank all of you for staying around, so many of you. This is a fantastic crowd for the last session of the day, and I have a pretty good reason. I think I know the reason for that, and that's because of our guest, His Excellency Mr. Imad Fakhoury, the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation. Your Excellency, welcome again to the Euromoney stage. Very, very pleased to have you here. You said it as we walked in and as we were talking that you hoped there'd been robust debate. I think there's been an element of that, and I hope that we can have a little more of that on this discussion. And as I also said, your two preceding colleagues, the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank Governor, talked not only but primarily about the need to build macroeconomic stability on one hand and to maintain financial stability on the other. They were very much, I hope you agree, the audience, putting forward this idea that you have to have stable foundations to build upon. And so really I think the thrust of our discussion should be towards, let us assume that those foundations are built. Sorry, I've lost the ability to speak English. But what are we going to build on them? So I've just flown in from Kuwait. I flew in last night and I spent the preceding week in Riyadh. Both countries, to a variety of degree, have visions for their futures. Now, this is not the place where we discuss those visions, although some of the Vision 2030 in Saudi has a role in Jordan through the NEOM project, whatever one thinks the likelihood of that happening is or not. What's Jordan's vision? So where do you see the country going? What do you see as the potential? And how will that make it more resilient to the external shocks that Jordan seems prone to, unfortunately, through no fault of its own, I must say?
Thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be with all our participants today. And to be fair and to build correctly on my two predecessors at the opening session, I think one has to also factor in the size of the disruptions that we faced to understand why was there a disruption and how are we resuming, let's say, the development path of the country. So the short answer, yes, of course, Jordan has a very clear vision of where we're heading. We are now at the beginning of the Jordan 2025, which was launched in 2015. But let's go back a little bit to the beginning of the 21st century. So Jordan was performing relatively well on the overall economy. We've done about 6.7% real growth from 2000 to 2010. We probably missed opportunities, and we have to always try to reflect backward to see where were the opportunities that we missed. And I think the reason why they look very clear now is because what happened in 2011 and the years that followed. So in 2011 was a very critical, disruptive year that has stayed disruptive for almost now 7 years. We had the so-called Arab Spring breakout. We lost our gas supplies from Egypt. Oil went up to $110, $120. Food commodities went up massively in prices. I think a lot of people forget what the disruption was. Then we had hundreds of thousands of refugees that came in. There were a failed state in Syria, a civil war. We had 380 kilometers with Syria, 180 kilometers with Iraq that became a massive security military burden that incurred costs actually to maintain the stability and the safety of Jordan. If you look at it in 2012 specifically, the cumulative fiscal effect, direct costs of these multiple crises was close to $5 billion. If we had not started a process to stop everything, focus on making sure we don't lose our fiscal, monetary, and macroeconomic stability, very few countries would have survived that. Why? We've had a 14% increase in population because of the Syrians, 1.3 million. If you add up, that's about 100 million going into the EU, that's about 64 million going into the US, And we're not comparing resources or per capita income or anything.
Just show volume.
So for people to understand what the disruption is to the size of our economy and the limited carrying capacity that Jordan has. And today, the total number of refugees in Jordan is 3.6 million. That's the largest population of refugees. Actually, Jordan hosts 15% of the world refugees. We're the largest country to do that. So, where do you go from that size of disruption? So the size of disruption fiscally was 5 billion. That's probably 45% of the budget at that time. Basically, if you don't take measures that are severe, excessive, and of course there are going to be tough austerity measures that are going to be anti-growth, but you would have lost the fiscal stability. Government would have not been able to pay its commitments, and we would have lost the stability of the JD, which has been a great strategic objective for macroeconomic stability in the country and continues to do that. So the first parallel track we worked on was very much stop the bleeding. We had excessive, quick decisions to get out of subsidies in the areas of oil products, in the areas of electricity. It took us about 3-4 years to fix the electricity. The downside, we did the fixing of these big subsidies by having the higher tranches cross-subsidize the lower ones. We still need to improve that going forward because it's inefficient on the high-paying sectors and so on. And we did that in collaboration with a standby arrangement with the IMF, followed with an extended fund facility, second program with the IMF. What did that do, that specific program? We built a gas terminal, we resumed the imports of gas, we moved very quickly and belatedly on accelerating the renewable energy. There was a very good point about disruption. We used a negative disruption to catch up. I wish we did that in the prior years. Of course, it's easier to look back when oil was very cheap and that was not a pressing priority on us. And in 2012, the total government revenue was covering only 67% of the current expenditures of government. You know what that means? You know, you're on your way to possibly become bankrupt if you didn't do that. And debt to GDP, which from 1990 to 2010 went down from 200% to low 60s, started to go up 5 percentage points every year for 7 years, until we peaked last year at 95%. So last year we closed the year fiscally at 95%, meaning the domestic revenues are covering back now 95. This is fiscal reliance. With the measures this year, we should be at 99. Hopefully next year, we'll be in a surplus mode on the current expenditure side. In a second track, we moved aggressively to increase assistance to Jordan. Not because we want to be less self-reliant, but because what has happened to Jordan with these external disruptions, the international community under the fair burden sharing principle should actually step up and assist a country that kept its border open, that received a lot of refugees, and did the moral and the right thing, as we have historically done always as a nation. And we had the introduction of the Gulf Cooperation Council Fund, the GCC Fund, which was pushed and implemented very well. It was the main reason we continue to have a capital expenditure program as a government. We launched the Jordan Compact and the Jordan Response Plan to document in partnership with the international community and the UN the burdens we are carrying as a nation, so that we hold them accountable and keep the pressure on them that this is a global public good as a nation hosting all these refugees, and it is also part of your responsibility as an international community to give us additional assistance and that. And we built on the fiscal reform measures to re-stabilize fiscally, monetary-wise, and macroeconomically on that. And the third parallel track, which was by 2015, we came back to the point after catching our breaths as a nation with all these massive disruptions, we resumed our development path. So up to 2010, we were at the midpoint of implementing the 10-year plan of 2005 to 2015, which was called the National Agenda. It had been disrupted massively. In 2015, we went back and launched a new 10-year plan, the Jordan 2025, to cover the next 10 years, having brought back the basis, as you mentioned, of fiscal, monetary, and macro stability, with a vision now to move and focus on growth, employment, competitiveness, and so on.
Okay, so there's so much in what you've just said. I'd like to unpack a bit of it.
Sure.
Let's start with the international community. I've said, you weren't here, but I was saying that speaking for the international community, which I can't, but I think what Jordan's done is amazing, and as you say, it's the ethical, moral thing to do, and many congratulations for doing that. Since you started that process, since the war in Syria started, we've seen Brexit, Trump, the rise of populism. We've seen some people would say that everyone is now more focused. We saw the European version of the refugee crisis, only 1 million, rather than the 100 million that it would be pari passu.
Rudely awakened a very wealthy continent.
Yeah, and it's causing serious issues in Germany. Angela Merkel's decision to do that. So a little bit of a taste of that was enough to see how disruptive it can be. But what I'm trying to get at is the support of the international community in various forms is still important to Jordan going forward. We still have a responsibility. I accept that. I'm sure many of others do too. But there are people in power who may be less sympathetic to that. Do you still feel that the things like the Jordan Compact, holding the UN, holding the US, the EU to account, do you still feel that the political will to continue to support Jordan is there from your dialogue with them?
I would argue that there is definitely an exception when it comes to Jordan, meaning that there's a great level of acknowledgement, admiration, sympathy that's translating into additional support that is coming to Jordan. However, let's put it in the right context. So yes, if you look at the assistance coming to Jordan, total assistance, which is budget support grants, regular grants that would come into projects, concessionary financing that would come in to development projects or budget support or to cover the financing gap of the treasury. So we have to borrow less from the market at much higher rates and so on. So the trend we see now that aid has shifted, meaning there's going to be less aid that comes as grants to support the budget, which is understandable, and we're now at a very good point where the government, out of its own resources, is seeing lesser grants coming to support the budget, but the fiscal self-reliance is increasing. So we're planning well for the future. Over all other avenues of aid that are not grants to support the budget are increasing, and we're using them well, and we're investing them in areas where it's unlocking potential, creating critical infrastructure, and doing that. So the short answer is when you see the world getting less aid in many cases, let's use the US. You just probably saw or read that Jordan signed the new 5-year MOU with the United States. I led the negotiating team. It took us 7 months at a time when aid, foreign assistance by the US was going down to everyone. Jordan was treated as an exception. We increased the MOU period for 5 years. The amount of minimum aid to Jordan increased 28%, from $1 billion in the prior MOU to $1.275 billion annually. And that's, of course, can be more every year depending on what Congress allocates. So that's a strong voice of the strategic partnership that Jordan has with the EU, with the US. Yes. The EU increased its aid, Germany increased its aid, France increased its aid, the UK increased its aid. And what's interesting for most people, Jordan at the end of 2010 became a middle-income country. And when you become a middle-income country, the OECD countries in the world usually choose not to give you aid. But they've all made exceptions given the circumstances that Jordan was undergoing that was not our own making, given the pivotal role that Jordan plays in peace, security, stability, fighting extremism, in interfaith dialogue, and so on. Jordan punches way above its weight. We're a small country with a great pivotal role, with a great contribution to the world and to the stability and security and the peacemaking of this region. And I think there's very good acknowledgement. So it's not just the West, with, including Canada and everyone else, but it's also China that stepped up, the Japanese, and so on. And yes, there's a new reality in the world that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries are talking more trade and investment rather than aid. And that's an adjustment we have to deal with. They are critical partners for us. They're critical partners for our exports of expatriate professional labor. They're export markets, they're an important investment partners, important tourist partners in terms of incoming tourism. So our relationship does not go through one prism, which is what is the assistance only.
Sure.
We have a full-fledged, comprehensive relationship with all the partners all around the world, and we're trying to maximize the development partnership, the investment partnership, the trading partnership, the tourism partnership, and as well the strategic, political, military security partnership with all our partners in the East, within the region, and with the West. And I think Jordan stands as a country that has been very effective in balancing relationships with countries that are at odds with each other globally, but are working with us jointly on, for example, the de-escalation zone in southern Syria, where you have Jordanians, Russians, and Americans having produced a stable zone in the south of Syria that has been a breakthrough and the most stable one in terms of the Syria conflict. And that's, I think, what is different about Jordan and how Jordan distinguishes itself.
Thank you. China. Where does Jordan fit into China's OBOR, One Belt, One Road? Does it fit? What are the Chinese, who have never really been that, I mean, they've always been a little quiet in this part of the world, but clearly President Xi is now putting the internationalization of China's economy and politics even higher priority than before. So where does China fit into this equation? You mentioned them, but maybe you could talk to more specifics about what they're doing.
Listen, China is a very important increasing partner. And I would argue it's not only China, but also India on the Asia side.
Sure.
So Jordan has always been a small country with big ideas and big ambitions. We always knew very early on as a nation that the best path for us is to integrate globally, open up the economy, and build relations with everyone. And this is part of diversifying, your partnerships,
yes,
and making sure that, you're part of where the majority of the countries in the world are heading to. So with China, we've had a tremendously increasing relationship. I think now they're the second largest trading partner with Jordan. We have developed a development even program with China, which usually deals with low-income countries, but they've made exceptions for Jordan. We have, in 2015, signed the highest level of strategic partnership, called the Strategic Partnership MOU, during the visit of His Majesty to China, which is the highest level of partnership that China has with any country. We are members in the One Road, One Belt, the Silk Road, and the Sea Road initiative, and we're working now on detailing these agreements. And China has been an aggressive partner in terms of bidding for infrastructural opportunities and projects in Jordan. Probably the largest project, which is the oil shell project, which is a Jordanian, Estonian, Malaysian, Chinese project.
Probably
2.2 billion.
Probably global project.
1.6 billion of that financing came from the Chinese partner and the Chinese institutions that support that. We're a founding member of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we're developing with all of them portfolios, projects, and abilities to tap into development financing that promotes and supports the private sector or the government in its development agenda.
So let's turn, thank you very much. I mean, we've really talked there about the international cooperation part of your role. Let's talk a little bit about planning, and I'm going to be stubborn and go back to my original question.
Sure.
Okay, so Jordan has weathered very well some pretty hard shocks to its economy. But where do you see, and now we're sort of at the place where the corner should begin to be turned, and you have lots of international partners who can help you there. But what is the vision for the economy in 2025, in 2030? What is this country going to look like economically that is really different from how it was in 2005 or 2010? Because I think that's the key thing that we've been missing today.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you told them, but let's tell them again.
So listen, Jordan was trying in the first decade of the 21st century to move from a patriarchal economy to a large extent, which is the legacy of the 20th century,
Yeah.
into a much more competitive, self-reliance, balanced economy that is very integrated into the global economy and so on. And we were slowly moving in that direction. I would argue we've had certain wrong policies. We've lacked some political will in terms of successive governments, taking a little bit deeper reforms in vertical and horizontal areas that could have compensated possibly some of the costs we have incurred during 2011 to 2017, but it's always smarter to look backward and so on. But it's important to always assess so we don't repeat that the next time. So given that we have articulated, a 14-month process that was very participatory to try to put the Jordan 2025 roadmap, socioeconomic roadmap for the country. And it is very much focused on two pillars, given the realities and the geopolitics surrounding us. And there is no indication, unfortunately, that the region around us is stabilizing in a way that anyone can predict. I think the uncertainty is so high that you have to kind of design your policies to factor in this high uncertainty in politics, in security, in military developments, in failed states, in whether the region is going to stabilize or not, and protect your national economy to the maximum, and try to see if you can bypass, logically without raising expectations, some of these heavy forces that are pulling you backward economically. So the vision is a more prosperous and resilient Jordan. We chose deliberately prosperity of our own citizens because that's ultimately the goal of what we need to do, but resilience because we need to remain resilient given the geopolitics surrounding us. And within our vision, we have great targets that we know that we want to achieve at the macroeconomy. We want to bring back debt to GDP to under 60%. Within the safe levels, we want to stay on the budget deficit, the unemployment, bring back to single digit, where today, unfortunately, we went up from about 11% in 2010 to 18.5% unemployment, average unemployment, with the biggest, I think, challenge for all of us as a nation, government, private sector, and international partners, the youth unemployment, which is close to 33% or 34%. We are focused on a much more productive and competitive economy that is based on a concept of economic growth engines that are led by 9 clusters. And it's not sectors, but clusters. These are clusters like in health, where we have health tourism, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and all of that as a cluster with backward-forward linkages that is creating the jobs of the future, doing that. I use that as an example, and so on. An economy that's very much has 4 objectives: an empowered and active citizen, a stable and safe society, an efficient and effective government, and a dynamically and globally competitive private sector. And this is truly the transformation we need to be leading. There are 7 principles to this vision, making sure that we're all law-abiding, the rule of law concept, a merit-based economy, government, private sector, so meritocracy, participatory approach. You can no longer do top-down in the 21st century. You have to do bottom-up, you have to create buy-in, you have to engage everyone, and we have not had a perfect track record of successive governments in that, and this has to become the modus operandi of the way we excellence, competitiveness, sustainability, and institutionalization. These are the 7 principles for a collective action of this nation, government in partnership with the private sector, with civil society, pushing that agenda forward. We are now implementing this 10-year roadmap through successive, what we call executive development programs. There are a 3-year integrated government development plan that is the basis of producing the 3-year budget that gets approved in Parliament. We need to be moving aggressively to make sure that we stay the course. We implement these reforms. We don't backtrack from that. We don't keep reinventing the wheel. We don't keep relaunching different documents every 2 years because we're fed up and we park this strategy on the shelf and so on. We stay the course on that, and within that overall high-level roadmap, I think what's going to be critical to get us there is the growth plan we have put in place, the human resource development strategy that is at the core of what makes Jordan different competitively, investing in our people, the digitization and e-government to transform government, and the full implementation of the Royal Commission on Enhancing Integrity and the Rule of Law, where we've pushed a huge package through Parliament, 13 critical judicial laws that need to be now implemented fully with bylaws and instructions through the judiciary and enforced fully to move us to the direction where we're achieving that. My message to all our private sector is the road is hard. There are no easy solutions. We're going to have to push hard on parallel tracks and sequentially to move Jordan to the paradigm shift we have envisaged in the Jordan 2025. I'm pleased to tell all our colleagues and partners in the private sector that at the government level, in partnership with all the donors, all the international financial institutions, we have designed a preliminary 5-year matrix in parallel tracks and sequentially of the critical reforms that we need to do, like the current secured lending law, which is in Parliament, in the Parliamentary Legal Committee that we're pushing very hard to complete, because it produces critical access to finance to our private sector, like the bankruptcy law that we're about to finish rewriting. We pulled it out of Parliament because it didn't have the best practice principles, and we're going to issue it within the next 2 weeks back to Parliament in expedited. We have a very aggressive agenda of reforms that we need to push very hard to transform and make sure Jordan goes to the vision I have articulated, which is very well mentioned. And I remind everyone, please go back to the Jordan 2025, use it in your lobbying as the private sector with government, and let's all of us do the roles that have been carved out for each one of us within that roadmap that we have put for the country.
We're nearly out of time, so I suppose I come to what is the pivotal question about these types of these plans and the steps that you're taking with the legal system and the government and all of that is, when are the people going to see the difference? Because it's never easy for government. I'm not a believer in that governments are bad, but sometimes it takes more time than governments admit for the effects of their policies to come through. And there's only so much promising one can do before you run out of road. And I think some of your regional colleagues, perhaps, I'm not going to mention names, but I think you probably know who they are, I feel are slightly over-promising, and are going to get to a point in a couple of years where they've made these big promises and they're not going to be able to deliver them, and that's going to cause them problems. Not significant problems, but problems. So delivery. I get the feeling that you're now going from the planning to the delivery. So talk a little bit about that and how you see this thing being delivered and when it'll make a difference.
I think one of the biggest weaknesses we've seen historically in Jordan is the delivery part in terms of strategic plans for the country and moving that forward. What we're trying to do differently this time is one, launching the delivery unit at the center of government, which is at the Prime Ministry. Dedicating enough resources to it so that it can track the implementation of the strategic pillars within these plans. We're tying in the budgets to the priorities within these plans, and what's outside that should no longer be funded by the government budget. We have all our international key development partners working with us on an aggressive 5-year employment and growth policy reform matrix, where they're also, promising to provide additional aid in return for incentivizing the government to be more aggressive on taking the necessary reforms horizontally and vertically, and in the right sequence. So I think we have, and we have also the reality that we have to be self-reliant. We can no longer think that somebody's going to come and give us a big amount budget support, and close the gap in the budget. We're going to have to do this on our own. And I think that reality has become entrenched. On the resilience side, I'm optimistic because Jordan, to a large extent, exited the subsidy system. So we moved away from subsidizing electricity, oil products, bread, and we redirected subsidies to Jordanians who deserve that. And that's a much better, efficient system for the market, much more impactful, because there was a huge amount of waste, or you're having a lot of people that don't deserve the subsidies that were benefiting from that. So on the fiscal resilience side, and once we see through the last part of this fiscal reform program that probably the Minister of Finance and the central bank government discussed, I think we'll be in a good position where we want to make sure that this alignment of development partners, the public's awareness, the private sector pressure on government, parliamentary pressure on government, and the lessons learned from prior experiences, hopefully we try to do this differently going forward with the right elements falling in place to get us to make sure that we're delivering. I want to mention one thing. I think government and private sector have to also have the right expectations. Let's be very realistic.
Yes.
So the government fiscally, for a few years, is not going to have big capital expenditure programs. And we're in austerity. And that's anti-growth by definition. On the monetary side, we have an interest rate environment globally, and we're pegged to the dollar, where interest rates are going to be going up. That's also going to be anti-growth to some extent. So the way in our plans we try to bypass these two constraints, and these are very big constraints. You ask the businesses, and they'll tell you that these are big constraints. So that's why I'm someone that doesn't want to overpromise. I think it's going to take us several years to go up slowly from the average 2% growth. You know, we've been growing at less than 1/3 the rate from 2011 to 2017 compared from 2000 to 2010. You know, 6.7 versus 2.1. That's a massive low growth rate. I think the other period where we've had that bad growth was 1967 to 73. I looked historically at the numbers. So this is unprecedented since a long time, and the size fiscally has been massive. So to bypass these two things, we need a strong push on implementing the reform, especially deregulation. I think we're over-regulating the economy and many sectors. That's going to require a strong partnership between government, private sector, and parliament to get this sorted out so that businesses see an improvement and ability to maneuver. And I've always been a champion of less government in these areas. We're going to have to maximize doing our capital expenditure as government, not from the treasury, but through public-private partnerships. And listen, Jordan in the past 10 years did $10 billion of PPPs at very difficult circumstances. So we have a good track record and we can do it. And finally, on the constraints of increasing interest rates, we're going to work closer as Ministry of Planning with the central bank to get more resources that will be put in the central bank to be given as loans to the bankers who represent this room, so they finance critical clusters or growth sectors that will be instrumental for growth and employment to help us bypass the two constraints of fiscal austerity and an environment of increasing interest rates.
Yeah. So, Minister, we've run out of time, but one final question. So, if we're sitting, and I hope we are, in these chairs or chairs like them in a year's time, what are the priorities that you'd like to see happen, have happened by this time next year? What should be different? What laws should have been passed, changes made, or projects completed, or initiated successfully?
I think that we have finished the IMF austerity program, hopefully, and we're towards the end of it next year.
Yep.
I think we would have pushed some of the critical laws through Parliament. Bankruptcy, secured lending are two critical. Today in Parliament there's a critical law on health accountability or medical accountability that will be critical for the health tourism segment, and I hope we succeed in pushing that through. I think there will be an announcement and a clear policy matrix of the next 5 years, the donors and the government pushing through the critical reforms we need to do. And I think there'll be also clarity on a pipeline of PPPs and projects that are being tendered out to deliver the capital expenditure. I think there has to be clear reporting through the government on how much we've implemented from the digitization agenda, the Jordan 2025 overall umbrella, and we...
I said one thing.
Yeah, and we report on an annual or semi-annual basis to the public. We've delivered on this. These are the things that are in the red, and these are the things that are still work in progress. So that type of a relationship where we're reporting through the delivery unit on progress against these plans, so the public rebuilds its confidence more back into government processes, that we're heading in the right direction.
Well, Minister, thank you very much. Your energy is extremely impressive, as always, and I'm sure we all feel more confident having listened to you and your commitment to doing this, and we look very much forward to interviewing you again in due course. So, before I let you go for lunch, please join me, don't clap yet, in thanking the Minister, and let me thank you for staying, and this is the close of the conference. So, thank you, Your Excellency.